Thank you, Jim. I didn't realize I did all those things. I must have. I know. It's crazy. I like to tell people it took me about 45 years to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up. But working as the executive director of the Gundalow company is probably the best thing I've ever done. So I really, really love my job and I love the people I work with. So as Jim said, tonight we're going to talk about Gundalows. I always like to try to feel for my audience to see how much they know and how much they don't know. So I'm going to ask a question. And the first question is, how many people have actually sailed on our Gundalow down in Portsmouth? All right, so 2 people. I assume the rest of you probably have an idea of what a Gundalow is, but maybe have never been actually on a Gundalow. So talk you through that, and we'll keep going here. The first thing I want to do, though, is sort of tell you what our mission is. So our mission is to protect the maritime heritage and the environment of the Piscataqua region through education and action. And we do our education portion of our mission using our Gundalow Piscataqua. We take approximately 2,000 to 2,500 students out every year. We have our own education program called Celebrating Our Rivers. And to date, we have taken over 23,000 students out on the water since she was launched in 2011. So it's a very popular field trip for the schools around us, and it continues to be popular. So that's keeping us in business. Okay, so what I'd like to do tonight is to take you on a little journey. We're going to start out with some Gundalow etymology. We're going to talk about the watershed in the Piscataqua region, some Gundalow characteristics, the cargoes they carried, a little bit about the captains that ran those Gundalows. And then I have a timeline and a design evolution. There were essentially 3 phases of Gundalows that were built over the 250 years that Gundalows were operating in the Piscataqua region. I'll talk to you about one of the most prolific Gundalow captains, Captain Edward Adams. Then we'll talk about 20th and 21st century Gundalows, because even though Gundalows went out of fashion at the end of the 19th century, they were brought back in the mid-1980s, and the predecessor to the Piscataqua was called the Captain Adams. And before that, the last Gundalow that Captain Adams actually built was called the Driftwood, and we'll talk about that. And then I have a video that I can show of the building of the Gundalow Piscataqua back in 2011. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. I do want to mention the main reference for the talk that I give and the information I put out comes from this particular book by Richard Winslow. It was written in 1983, and it's called The Piscataqua Gundalow Workhorse of a Tidal Basin Empire. So if you're interested, it's no longer in print, but you can find copies of this out on Amazon. It's a nice book, covers a lot of history, and it also covers a lot of details about Gundalows that I won't get into today, otherwise we'll be here for 3 or 4 hours. So I don't think you want to do that. All right, Gundalow etymology. So people always ask me where the word or where the term Gundalow came from. So you probably are familiar with a picture of something like this, which is a gondola. So this is a picture of a gondola in Venice. So gondolas, they have flat bottoms. They are operated by a gondolier who stands in the stern of the gondola and uses a long oar called a sweep to steer and to propel the gondola as it goes through. So a lot of the things that made its way to North America in terms of shipping came from the ideas that were developed and built in the Mediterranean and Europe. So this is an example of an idea that came across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic and made its way to North America and New England specifically. So gondola is the first iteration of that word. So in our research, what we found is these phrases up here: gondola, gondella, Gundalow, Gundalow with an E, and then eventually you get down to Gundalows, Gunlows, and Gundalow. So the various accents, things like that, and the way people spelled things back then, it just eventually got to a point where you wind up with the word Gundalow, which is down there on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. All right, so Gundalow etymology. Now you understand where Gundalow comes from. We'll talk a little bit about the Piscataqua region, which is where these Gundalows operated. So I like to say that this is what the Piscataqua region looked like 50,000 years ago. It was covered by a sheet of ice a mile thick. So that's what it looked like. But as this is 50,000 years ago. So 14,000 years ago, the glaciers, the ice sheet started to recede and melt. And as it did, it sort of dug out the topography and the geography of the Piscataqua region. And eventually, when you get to the 16th and 17th centuries, you have this as your map of the region, if you will. So one of the things that I'll point out is that when European explorers and then European settlers came to this area, they noticed a couple of things. One was there was a lot of water and that land masses and islands were separated. So there had to be a way of transporting people and things back and forth between those. What they noticed was the indigenous people who lived there were using the waterways as a very efficient form of transportation. So knowing what they knew about in the Mediterranean and Europe and boat building and things like that, they brought that information with them. And they started to understand that in order for them to be able to transport things efficiently, fast, they had to do something on the water. This particular map shows the Piscataqua watershed, and a watershed is an area where all of the things geographically feed rainfall and water, things like that, feed into a common area. So the common area here is Great Bay, which is down. See if I can do this with the pointer. Maybe not.
Little bar, the top of most.
There it is. Okay, there you go. Sorry. So this area here is Great Bay, and there's Little Bay here. You'll notice that there are 6 rivers that feed into Great Bay and the Piscataqua region. So you have the Swampscott River here. You have the Lamprey River. You have the Oyster River, the Bellamy River, the Cocheco River, the Salmon Falls River. They all feed into the Piscataqua River. And the Piscataqua River then flows down through Newington into Portsmouth and then out to the Gulf of Maine. So again, a lot of water there. The other thing they noticed was that the tidal range in this area was pretty steep. It's about 8 feet on average. So low tide and high tide, there's a difference of 8 feet there. And what that did was, as the tide was coming in or going out, the water volume that went through the rivers caused a very, very fast current. In fact, the current on the Piscataqua River is said to be the second fastest navigable tidal river current in the lower 48, only second to the Columbia River in Oregon. So they noticed that they had essentially a natural way of propelling vessels. But the problem they had was with the tidal range there, they also saw that there was a lot of mud when the tide went out that they had to contend with. So all these things kind of factored into what Gundalows eventually became when they were being built. Okay. All right, so where did Gundalows come from? I already mentioned that in the Mediterranean and Europe, the ideas came across to North America and New England. So essentially they started out as barges or scows or lighters. A barge obviously is something that carries cargo. A scow can be cargo. You probably associate scows with things like garbage, in this day and age more than anything. And then lighters were essentially vessels that took cargo from bigger ships and brought that cargo ashore. So a lighter, that's what it means essentially, to lightens the load of the big ship and brings it to shore. So here's a picture of a Thames River barge. So this is the one that operates up and down the Thames River in the UK. And you can see there that that has sails on it. It has a fairly shallow draft. If you saw it from above, you would see that it also has a pretty wide beam. So those are kind of characteristics of Gundalows. And then also over in Holland and Amsterdam, you have vessels like this, which are very similar to the Thames River barges. So that's kind of where the concept came from for Gundalows. All right, some Gundalow characteristics. First of all, these Gundalows were very simply designed. There was nothing complicated about them. The other thing about Gundalows is they were not built at shipyards. They were built on the properties of the people who wanted to own them and operate them. So you didn't have to be a shipwright or know anything about shipbuilding necessarily, but you could definitely build your own Gundalow and use it. All Gundalows had flat bottoms. And I mentioned earlier that, when the tide went out, there were a lot of mud flats around the area. So if you had a vessel that had a keel on it, it wouldn't do very well in a mud flat. It would tip over and your cargo would spill into the mud. So the flat bottom was how they solved that problem. So Gundalows could go to float up on the tide. When the tide went out, they could sit on the bottom and they could wait for the next tide cycle to move forward or move, back up, either upriver or downriver, whichever way they were going. All of them had shallow drafts. That map that I showed you with all the water there, all the towns that built up around the watershed started out at the heads of the tides. So in other words, the tide water would come in and it would get to a certain point topographically where it couldn't go any further. And essentially that's where the rivers were feeding into the estuary, the Great Bay estuary and Little Bay and places like that. So that's where the towns built up because they could use the water power that was coming down from the rivers to build mills. So they had sawmills, they had textile mills, they had all sorts of things. There were brick factories and things like that. Excuse me, that grew up from that particular. So the shallow draft allowed these vessels to get pretty far upriver, almost to the head of the tide. They had an angled bow and stern. So the reason for that was because when they started out in the 1600s, there was no infrastructure. There were no harbors, there were no quay walls, there were no wharves. So in order to get your Gundalow to a place where you could onload or offload cargo, you essentially had to beach it. So the angled bow and the angled stern allowed you to run your Gundalow up onto the shoreline. And that was the way you were able to offload your cargo, keep it dry, and then onload cargo that you could take back with you. Most of them were undecked, meaning that they were just essentially a shell, like a barge or a scow there. And then all of them had wide beams. And what I mean by wide beams, they're wide so they could carry as much cargo as possible. The thing about Gundalows is they were considered to be the 18-wheelers of the region for the time frame they were in operation from about 1650 to about 1900. So that's where you got your cargo, and that's how things got from point A to point B in that Piscataqua watershed. Some of the Gundalow cargoes that were carried: timber, masts, so things that came out of the sawmills. The Europeans, when they got here, the reason they came to New Hampshire and the Piscataqua region was because of fishing. They had overfished the grounds close to the eastern side of the North Atlantic. So they kept coming west and eventually wound up here in New England. And it was said that the fish were so plentiful, the cod, that you could walk on the backs of the cod from boat to boat without getting your feet wet. And the cod were essentially 6 feet tall. So, or 6 feet long, I should say. So fishing was the reason they came here. But once they got here, they also noticed that there were very old growth forests that surrounded the water, and they had a lot of trees in them that had very straight growing pines and things like that. And that timber was used to build ships' masts with. And so they were harvested for that particular purpose. In fact, when the British still, we were colonies of the British, the British ship makers would come over here and they would tag the trees that they wanted for masts. And if colonists cut down one of the king's trees, they got into a lot of trouble for that. So the timber was one of the cargoes. Bricks and quarried stone a little bit later on in Gundalow history. In fact, they said the bricks that were made in the Piscataqua region actually wound up in the back bay of Boston on the streets there. Salt marsh hay, which if you've been down to the Portsmouth and New Hampton or Portsmouth and Hampton area, there's a lot of salt marsh down there. So the salt marsh hay that would grow would be harvested by farmers and brought back to their farms. It was good feed for the livestock they had over the winter. And it was especially good because it had salt in it. So they didn't have to have a problem with their livestock not getting enough salt. Salt marsh hay was also used as insulation in their houses. It was also used to put in their bedding. And it was also ground up and used as mulch for their gardens and their crops. Cordwood and coal. When the brick factories started to be built, they needed to be able to fire their kilns. So firewood became a really big cargo that Gundalows would carry, and also coal for the same reason. They also carried people, not typically one of their biggest cargoes, but they would carry people from town to town if they were going in that direction. And they also carried troops. Um, so one of the things that maybe people don't know is that the Revolutionary War supposedly started in Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, but there was a confrontation in Portsmouth at Fort William and Mary in December of 1774, 4 months before the first shots were fired in Lexington and Concord. The townspeople raided the fort. They took the ammunition, the powder, and the cannons, put them on Gundalows, got them upriver, got them into the towns at the heads of the tides, and the townspeople hid that ammunition, powder, and cannon so the British could not find it. And there's also accounts that some of that ammunition, cannon, and powder made its way to the Battle of Bunker Hill. So they did carry troops essentially in that case. Barrel staves, most everything was packed in barrels back then, so barrel staves were another popular cargo for them. And then, of course, manufactured goods. Taking manufactured goods from the textile mills upriver down to the deep water port of Portsmouth, and they were loaded onto ships and they were transported up and down the East Coast, across to Europe, and down into the Caribbean. So Gundalow builders and captains, mostly farmers, fishermen, property owners, and merchants. Again, there were no plans for these or drawings for these boats. They were built from memory of what they had, seen in the Mediterranean and Europe. But there was a lot of corporate espionage that went on, at least that's what I call it. So as farmers and property owners built Gundalows and added features to them, other Gundalow captains would see those things and start to add them, whether it was to be more efficient or to carry more cargo or whatever it was. So a lot of spying went on, I guess you would say, between the Gundalow captains there. They always used material found on their property to build their Gundalows. They did not go and buy wood. They didn't do that. They just harvested the wood that was on their property and used that to build their Gundalows. All the Gundalow captains, they knew the waterways and all the dangers, the rocks, the shallows, the eddies. And if you've ever been up and down the Piscataqua River, you know there's a lot of areas there that are a little dangerous with small boats. So Gundalows were built so that they could handle those particular hazards, get through them without having too much trouble. Gundalow captains were considered a lower class than regular ship captains because Gundalow captains didn't have to go through that whole career path, if you will, of becoming a midshipman or a crew member and working your way up to different positions on the ships. So Gundalow captains could be anybody. And they were considered lower class than ship captains. They were treated that way too, which was unfortunate. They were known to have tipped the bottle while underway. So there are accounts of Gundalow captains as they made their way downriver, as they passed the property. A lot of times other Gundalow captains would see them go by, they would ring a bell. If they rang the bell, then the Gundalow captain would pick up his jug and he'd take a swig and he'd put it back down. So by the time that captain got to, I don't know, down to Portsmouth, he probably was feeling no pain at all. But that's kind of how they did it back then. Having said all this about Gundalow captains, I will say that they were innovative, strong, adaptable, and resourceful. They don't get enough credit for that. I mean, the way they developed their craft, the way they operated their craft, the way they made money by taking cargo from point A to point B, all that stuff was very entrepreneurial and took a lot of thought and effort. So they really are kind of interesting, unique people. So let's talk a little bit about design evolution here. As I mentioned, 3 phases of Gundalows. I have a little timeline I'll go through here. So we know Native Americans were here from about 11,000 years ago all the way up through today. But when European settlers arrived in 1500, there were pretty vast populations of the indigenous people here. Explorers started coming to this region in the 1530s. Permanent settlement started in 1623 down in Portsmouth. There were 2. There was one at Odiorn Point and there was one in Portsmouth. Portsmouth wasn't called Portsmouth at the time. It was called Strawberry Bank because there were banks of strawberries along the rivers. So that's how they got that name. Let's see here. The first Gundalows start showing up around 1650, and they'll continue on to about 1900. So here's a picture of what a first phase Gundalow would look like. On the left-hand side is simply an undecked Gundalow. It's a barge. It has two oars. That's what they look like on the bow there, but they're actually called sweeps. And those were used to either propel or steer the Gundalow. To steer the Gundalow, they would take one of those sweeps and they would put it into the stern and use that as a rudder to steer the Gundalows back and forth. These lasted for about 150 years. Eventually, the technology got a little bit better, and Gundalow captains realized that they had a sail on their Gundalow, they could get from point A to point B faster, which meant they could make more runs and make more money. So they started putting on masts with square rig sails. These were not very maneuverable, and they only worked if the wind was coming from your stern. They were not, you could not sail these like a regular sailboat. So as long as those conditions were, happening, you could get, to points faster and get more cargo back and forth and make more money. Let's see. Back to our timeline here. Bridges start being built in 1775. The only reason I bring this up is because they presented a problem to Gundalows, especially ones that had masts with square rig sails. So that's going to come to be a problem as time goes on here, but I just wanted to show that to you. The next phase of Gundalows, intermediate Gundalows, a little bit different here. They still had the mast, they still had the square rig sail, but you'll notice that in the stern, and it's a little hard to see because this picture's not great, but right down here, they added a rudder and a tiller to steer. So no longer were they using those long sweeps to steer their Gundalow. They actually had a rudder and a tiller to be able to maneuver. That made them a little bit more manageable, but they still had sweeps in here to help them get off of the beach, and in some cases to kind of pull themselves along when they got closer to the mud flats. This apparatus right here, we believe, is the beginnings of the decking of the Gundalows and was used mostly to carry salt marsh hay so they could keep it dry. All right. Not that this is a picture from 1860, but we think this was the late 1800s. And a couple things about this photograph. This is an intermediate phase Gundalow, but this is down the Merrimack River, the river that separates Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And that's salt marsh hay being harvested. You have a gentleman back here using a sweep to steer. And then you have a gentleman up here who's holding one of the longer sweeps, and he's using to pull, push them off of the mud if there's, that's a problem there in the channel. And you have two children in the back. Each of them have a sweep with them. I don't know if they're doing any good, but they're back there doing that. So this is an example. These, I said 18, I guess it was about 1800 when these were the intermediate phase Gundalows were around. They obviously lasted longer that in different places. So you had that. Yeah. All right, back to our timeline real quick. The next thing, the first sails were installed about 1800. So this is something that we've been having a lot of trouble with in terms of our research. I showed you that the intermediate phase Gundalows had sails on them. And around, as you get closer to 1800, but we know that there were sails on Gundalows even before that. We just haven't been able to nail down the exact date. So that's the best date that we have, is the 1800s, is when the sails started to be put on there. That caused the problem with the bridges, because as Gundalows approached bridges with the mast and a sail, typically they were taller than the bridge was. They couldn't go through the bridge, so they either had to take the sail and the mast down, or they had to stop there, offload their cargo, and have someone else pick it up and carry it further upstream or downstream. So it just created a problem. It took them a while to solve that problem. And before they solved the problem, the railroad started to come into New Hampshire about 1838, and that's kind of the precursor to the death of Gundalows, if you will. In 1860, they solved the problem of the bridges by adding something called a lateen rig, and I'll show you what that looks like. that allowed them to rate or to lower their mast and their sail to get under the bridges and then put them back up so that they didn't have to stop there at the bridge. They could continue up or downstream, whichever way they were going. And then the last operating Gundalow was launched in 1888, called the Fanny M. It was launched or built by Captain Edward Adams. All right, the last phase of Gundalows were Piscataqua River Gundalows, popular between 1860 and 1900. And I have a drawing here to point out sort of the differences between a regular Gundalow and a Piscataqua River Gundalow. So first of all, the sailing rig here. This is called a lateen rig, and lateen is a variation of the word Latin, so it came from the Mediterranean. If you've ever seen pictures of ships and vessels in the Middle East called dhows and feluccas, they all have lateen rigs for their sailing. So a lateen rig is essentially a short stump mast here, okay, and then a long yard. So essentially that yard is the same as a mainsail, but instead of the mainsail being pulled up to the top of the mast, essentially what you're doing here is you're turning that sail kind of upside down at an angle, and the sail gets pulled outwards instead of upwards for that. So this allowed them to lower down their yard. These were about 20 feet tall, and most of the bridges were over 20 feet high. So they could get everything underneath the bridge and then go put everything back up. A couple other differences with the sail that has about 900 square feet here, they needed something to be able to counteract the force of the wind. So they added a thing called a lee board. So that lee board is on the port side of the Gundalow, and it allows them to essentially travel in pretty much a straight line without getting pushed to the side by the wind. So they added a cuddy cabin in the back here, excuse me, so that sailors and the captains would have a place to sleep when the tide went out and they had to rest on the bottom. And then they changed their steering rig back here. And I have a picture of that in the next slide that I'll show you. But it went from a tiller to actually a ship's wheel here. So those are Piscataqua River Gundalows, and they were in existence from about 1860 and 1900. So that steering rig is this is what it looks like. So you have the tiller and the rudder. This is the rudder post here. Here's the tiller. The tiller arm is attached to the deck with these block and tackles, and then it actually go around another block and tackle out here and up to this drum. The drum is attached to the wheel. So when you turn that wheel, it turns the drum, it pulls the tiller from one side to another. So it was a much better way of steering the Gundalow. The problem is, when you see pictures of captains who are behind the wheel of on a ship, they're standing behind the wheel and they're going in the opposite, they're going where the captain's looking. These, you have to put your back to the wheel and steer this way, kind of off to the side, because you really can't stand behind them because of this apparatus here. But that's the ones that they use there. And then I have a picture of our Gundalow on its maiden voyage here. So that's what we look like there. One of the things I talked about was the Gundalows going under the bridge. They called that shooting the bridge. So this is our Gundalow going up the Bellamy River. If you've ever been to Portsmouth, Route 4 goes across the Bellamy River and Little Bay. And this is the bridge. So this is the Gundalow approaching the bridge. The gentleman standing on the bow has a fishing net here. He's about 6 foot, so that's about 7.5 to 8 foot to the top there. What he's doing, and this is our advanced technology in determining whether or not you can get through the bridge, he's going to see if the top of that net touches the bridge. If it does, then we put the engine in reverse and we don't go through. So the next picture, there we are. So it's kind of weird because he's stumped over like he's going to hit it, and I think that's the top of the net there. But we got through there and we're able to put everything back up and sail again. So, but that was called shooting the bridge. Gundalow captains were known to be able to do that, in minutes. Get the rig down, get under the bridge, get the rig back up, and continue going. Gundalows impacted not just the economy of the region, but they also impacted the culture. And there's a couple of photographs I have here, or actually pictures, I should say. John Stobart is a marine artist who was pretty much world famous. He did a painting here of some of the clipper ships that were in port in Portsmouth. This, if you know Portsmouth, this is Tugboat Alley. So the shops on the left-hand side there are still there. That building is still there. And the building on the right-hand side is also still there. The stuff in the middle there is kind of changed over time. But you'll notice kind of in the background there, the ship that's along the wall, the seawall there, is a Gundalow. And I have a little bit better picture in the next slide. And you'll see that that Gundalow is acting as a lighter. So it's taking cargo off of the larger ship, putting it on there, and then they would take it ashore. So that's a Gundalow acting as a lighter, not just transporting cargo from Portsmouth to Exeter or places like that. There's another picture of or another painting of a Gundalow. This is, we believe, down in Hampton along the salt marshes. There's salt marsh hay piled up here. The Gundalow captain is standing on top of the salt marsh hay. He's got his sail up. We don't know why, because this is such a narrow area that I don't know how you would steer with that sail and be able to maneuver. It's just kind of weird. But that's how it was painted. These things in the back here are not trees. They're called staddles, and they're stacked high with salt marsh hay. So they would harvest the salt marsh hay, put them on these staddles to dry, and then come back and then bring them up upriver, but with Gundalows. Some photographs. Here's the Fanny M, the last operating Gundalow. It's full of brick going down river towards Portsmouth. Oops. Here's another, we think this is the Fanny M, we're not sure. The only problem with this photograph is that you'll notice that there is no stump mast and there is no yard. So we don't know if that was taken off to be able to carry this much cordwood, but that's how they piled the cargo very high. The Gundalow captain would have to stand on top of the cuddy cabin to be able to see what was going on in front of him. And then here's another photograph. We know this is the Fanny M. Cordwood again. You can see the steering mechanism. We believe this is Captain Edwards Adams' son Cass operating it, but stump mast, sail, all that good stuff.
What's that along the back? What's all the,
This?
no, that's no. The one on the left tree, that's not just the tree behind it.
That could be another vessel in here. You talking about that?
Well, no, if you go raise up, all the brush along the, I think it's front of the bow of the sail.
Oh yeah, I think that's
The sail hasn't quite gotten past the tree.
right. Yeah. So Gundalows were, when they were built, their life expectancy was about 5 years, and after 5 years they were beached along the river or the bay, and the elements took their toll on those vessels, and the operators or captains would build another Gundalow and continue on. So this is the Fanny M in its last throes. It was beached in, we think this is Dover Point. And so therefore, the elements are getting to it. A lot of the things are taken off. So you don't have a stump mast, you don't have a yard. That's a windlass. There's the cuddy cabin, there's the rudder. So the steering mechanism was taken off. So it's just kind of left to go. All the wood just kind of deteriorates there. So I wanted to talk about Captain Adams because he was probably the most prolific and most famous of the Gundalow builders. Not only was he a boat builder, but he was also a model builder. The Portsmouth Public Library has, I think it's like 100 of the models that he carved out of wood. He also did decoys and things like that. So they're all kind of collected in the Portsmouth Public Library. He was a hotel manager. The place where he lived on Adams Point was a boarding house. And so he was kind of he and his wife were the manager of that. He was an innovator. He's the one that came up with all the things that make a Piscataqua Gundalow a Piscataqua Gundalow. He collected a lot of data, weather data, cargo, time, all that kind of stuff. He collected that information, and he was also a tireless environmental advocate. In the 1920s, he found out that the people in Concord at the Capitol were discussing the possibility of damming up Great Bay and Little Bay. So building a dam where the Piscataqua River runs by Little Bay. And he realized that if you dammed the Little Bay and Great Bay at that point, what you would do is create a giant cesspool, because those 6 rivers that feed into it, there were no wastewater treatment plants back then. So all of the waste that you created went into the rivers, and they went downriver towards the Atlantic. And so if there was a dam there, that stuff would just collect and it would kill the fish, it would kill the eelgrass and all that stuff, the oysters. So he got all the people that lived in that area to contact their state representatives and to tell them that this is a bad idea, and they actually decided not to put a dam there. So smart guy. And then the last thing I'll say about him was he was also sort of a visionary, because he understood the importance of Gundalows and why, how they helped build the economy in the area. So he actually did drawings and took photographs, submitted them to the Works Progress Administration and the Smithsonian. And the drawings that were used to build the Captain Adams and our Piscataqua came from the Smithsonian, that were done by Captain Adams. So kind of a unique guy. Keep getting my thing messed up here. All right, 20th and 21st century Gundalows. Back to our timeline real quick. 3 Gundalows were built in the 20th, or 2 Gundalows were built in the 20th century, and 1 was built in the 21st. The first one was the Driftwood. I'll talk about that in a second. Second one was the Captain Adams, which was launched in 82. And then the Piscataqua, our Gundalow right now, was launched in 2011. All right, the Driftwood. Built between 1931 and 1950, 19 years it took them to build this Gundalow. And the reason for that is because they made it with the driftwood they found on their property. So they didn't cut any trees down. They just went down to the beach and pulled the wood and then formed it to make whatever they needed to do on the Gundalow. This was also the Gundalow here was about 44 feet. It had a 13-foot beam, and it had a 5 to 6 foot draft, which is about double the normal draft of a Gundalow. The reason for that is that Captain Adams wanted to make this a passenger carrying Gundalow, so he could ferry people from Newmarket and Durham down to Portsmouth and back. So in order to be able to do that in a timely fashion, he also decided to add an engine. So they built the Driftwood with 2 Model A engines. It was launched on the 22nd of October, 1950. It made its first and last voyage that day. So I'll tell you why. So here's the launching of the Driftwood. Thousands of people showed up because they realized this was kind of Captain Adams' last thing he was going to do. Gundalow went down the shipways, went into Great Bay. They started the engines. Gundalow went out into the bay, started operating around the bay, and then all of a sudden the engines quit. So it turns out that when you have a combustion engine, you need a way to cool the components of the engine, otherwise they seize up. So somebody forgot to open the stopcock on the engines to let the water get in there. And so both engines seized, and they towed the Driftwood back to the shore, and it sat along the shore. That was the first and last voyage ever made. Captain Adams died 3 months later, and his son never had the motivation to salvage the Driftwood and sail it again. So it just sat just like the other Gundalows and was deteriorated. The environment got to it. So the other Gundalow was built in the 20th century was the Captain Edward Adams. This is a photograph of its launching here. It was an exact replica of a Piscataqua River Gundalow. So everything on it was authentic. It was not designed to carry passengers, so the Coast Guard couldn't tell them they had to have an engine and fire suppression system and dewatering pumps and things like that. This Gundalow was towed from town to town, and it would go, to a dock in a town, and then they would invite school children to come down to do programs on dockside, but that was about it. It could carry volunteers, but not passengers. So that operated from 1982 into the 2000s. And then about 2008, the maintenance on this particular Gundalow was getting to be so expensive that Strawberry Bank Museum, who owned it, decided they were going to just deaccession it, which means get rid of it. So the volunteers that were doing the education programs on the Adams decided that they were going to form the Gundalow Company and take over ownership of the Adams. And they did that. And she operated for another year or two. Again, it was becoming too expensive to maintain it. So they decided that they were going to build the Piscataqua. And they were going to make some changes to it so that they could carry passengers and not just do dockside education programs. So Gundalow, Piscataqua, conceived prior to the Adams retirement. Built on the grounds of Strawberry Bank Museum, which is where the Edwards was built, or the Edward Adams was built, I should say, and using the drawings from the Fanny M. Its length is 66 feet, its beam is 18 feet, its draft is 3¼ feet, and it displaces 58 tons. Pretty much an average Piscataqua River Gundalow. It's built to conduct underway maritime education programs for schools around the watershed. Launched on December 14th, 2011 at Pierce Island. Safety features: lifelines, watertight bulkheads, a 230 horsepower diesel engine, mechanical dewatering pumps, fire suppression systems, and not that it was done in 2011, but we just added a marine radar so that we could operate if the fog ever rolls in, which it does quite frequently down in the Piscataqua. Let's see here. It remains in service, and as I mentioned, we've taken over 23,000 students out and run them through our programs. So we continue to have strong response for that. So building the Piscataqua. Materials. So all the materials were collected before the construction started. The framing is 2-inch by 8-inch white oak from Western Massachusetts. The planking along the bottom is 4-inch white oak. Top sides 2½-inch oak. The knees, the supports for the Gundalow are Hackmatack, which is a species of poplar from Nova Scotia, and then live oak from the Charlestown Navy Yard. I'll tell you the story here. So as the Hackmatack was being delivered, Molly Bolster, who's my predecessor, got a phone call from a gentleman who was down at the Charlestown Navy Yard. They were building or excavating to build a new building on this shipyard there, and they came across a stash of wood that had been used for wooden ships when they were building wooden ships back then. So apparently they buried the wood to preserve it. I don't know how that works, but that's what they did. They came across 25 ship knees, and they wanted to know if we wanted to use any of their knees. So we took 24 of those knees, and they are actually in the Gundalow Piscataqua. I've got a couple of pictures to show you that. The decking is white pine from stormfell trees at Three River Farm in Dover, New Hampshire, so just upriver from where Portsmouth is. The fasteners that hold things together, the metal fasteners, are silicon bronze screws and through bolts. And then the planking, for the most part, is held together with trunnels, tree nails, which I think the Virginia has quite a few of as well. There. A couple of the features of Piscataqua. Sailing rig is a lateen, just like the Piscataqua River Gundalow. Stump mast is 20 feet in height. It's one solid piece of wood. It sits in a tabernacle, which is not typically how they were built. So the tabernacle allows you to take the stump mast and lower it all the way down to the deck. So that was something that regular Gundalows back in the 1880s didn't have the capability of doing. The yard is hollow. It's 64 feet long, and it's laminated spruce. Interesting to see how that works. The rigging, stump mast and the yard can be lowered with 6 people using block and tackles, or with an electric windlass or winch. It only takes 3 people to do that. The lee board sits at a 35-degree angle to the surface when the sail is raised. There's 900 square feet of sail there, and this Piscataqua can sail up to 65 degrees to the wind, which is kind of unique for that. So our yard can turn. We can jibe and tack, but it takes quite a bit of effort and a lot of wind. So on a light wind day, we're not really jibing or tacking. We're using the engine to get our stern around or our bow through the wind, or whatever you want to do there. A couple of photographs here. Here's some of the Hackmatack knees that were coming in to be formed. Here are some of the ones from the Charlestown Navy Yard. This is our master shipwright, Paul Rollins. He's working with one of those Charlestown Navy Yard knees, getting ready to fasten it into the Gundalow. This is a gentleman who's using a machine to create trunnels. So that trash can is full of trunnels. Here's a shot from the stern looking towards the bow, and those are the mixture of the Hackamattack and the Navy Yard knees down there. Here's our resident. He's kind of a character, Gino Scalzo. He's doing the he's putting the oakum into the seams. He's caulking. Thank you. That's the word I couldn't think of. Caulking. So he's using a chinking hammer and a chisel there to get that oakum in there. He actually taught the volunteers how to do that. So they're making oakum that's going to go into the seams. Here's our rudder. So rudders on Gundalows were called barn door rudders because, again, everything came from the property owner and the property they were on. So when the barn door was starting to get a little shaky, you took it down and you made it a rudder for your Gundalow. So you can see that that rudder is pretty big. To be able to navigate in the current in the Piscataqua, that rudder had to be pretty good size. But here's our diesel engine being installed, 230 horsepower. Here's the Gundalow being brought over to Pierce Island for launching. And again, there's another picture of her on her maiden voyage. The education programs we do for the schools, the program is called Celebrating Our Rivers. And it's designed to sort of show students a little bit about the history of the area and also a little bit about the science involved in the environment. So schools will come and we'll break them up into 3 different groups. And one group will go and do some navigation work. We give them handheld compasses. We show them a chart. We show them how to fix their position on the water, which most of them have never even thought about why they would have to do that. Another one, we have a marine animal station, so we'll bring lobsters and scallops and sea urchins and all sorts of things like that so that students can hold them if they want and learn about them. And then we do a water quality station along with that. So we do some water samples and show them the difference. We do a plankton tow involved so they can see the phytoplankton and the zooplankton that's there. And then the last station that they do is called Human Impact. And the Human Impact Station is a 3-dimensional model of the watershed where they get to understand that what happens on the land can wind up in the water. It's hard to describe that. You have to see it to understand it. But one of the things that I was so impressed with when I was interviewing for the job was when I watched them doing that with a school, the kids that were involved, when they saw that what was happening on the land was going into the water, the light bulbs on their, above their heads all went on. And almost simultaneously, they all said, it's going in the water. So they understood that, what happens on land in the water. And then we asked them about the tides, because they think that it just washes out into the Gulf of Maine and keeps going. So you take the model and you tip it up and the water rushes back into the river. And we say that's the tide bringing that stuff that you thought was going out to the Gulf of Maine all the way back in. So that's one of the most talked about stations that we do. And we have other programs we do with middle school and high school students. We have a thing called Reading Our Rivers. So there's a lot of literature that's been written about the Piscataqua region. And so they'll have a high school English teacher or a middle school teacher, an English teacher, come and talk about some of the literature and the books and things like that were read or written. And they'll read excerpts from the books and things like that so that they can see that's part of it. So it's almost like a STEAM, STEAM program. So science, technology, education, the arts, and math there. And then we do shore programs along with them. So we split the class in half. Half of them stay ashore, half of them go on the Gundalow, and then when they come back from the Gundalow, we switch them out. But the shore programs are things like simple machines and a role-playing game called Piscataqua People, where they take on the roles of merchants and shopkeepers and farmers and sailors and things like that. And it's a really cool kind of thing to do.
Separate building.
All that's done on the Gundalow or on the lawn in front of our dock.